Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a truly fascinating philosophical time capsule. We are going to explore a unique framework created by an author named Yehuda Halfon. It's a system that actually attempts to map the most complex human relationships, and eventually the fate of modern society itself, straight onto a mathematical grid. It's this wild blend of geometry, traditional philosophy, and social critique.
I mean, it sounds almost impossible, right? Can you really take the incredibly messy dynamics of love, dependency, career ambitions, gender, and just reduce them all down to an X and Y axis? Well, our source material today attempts to do exactly that. We're going to look at a highly structured geometric model of human partnership to see how mathematical principles might actually explain our emotional and societal realities.
Section 1. A shift in perspective. So, to really understand this model, we have to travel back a bit to 1995. That's when Yehuda Halfon wrote these essays as a tool for his teenage daughter, basically to help her view life's complexities from a completely different angle. Okay, let's dive right into this mathematical metaphor. To build his model of marriage, Halfon leans heavily on this concept of orthogonal axes. If you remember your high school geometry, orthogonal lines intersect at strict right angles, which means they are completely independent of one another. So keep that word in mind, orthogonal. It represents these independent perpendicular forces that have to interact to create a shared life in his framework.
Section 2. The relationship coordinate system.
The source text builds this model out by taking two separate sets of intersecting axes and layering them directly on top of each other to graph a shared life between two people. And what's truly fascinating here is how starkly this first coordinate system charts the individual ego. On one axis, we have what he calls the leading self. Think of this as pure initiative, the drive for a career above all else, self-realization, putting the self front and center. But then, perpendicular to that is the following self. This axis is all about passivity, a willingness to follow blindly, surrendering one's own ego, and a total dependence on a partner.
Now, the second coordinate system graphs gender, and it does so based on some highly traditional 1995 roles, exactly as defined by the author. In this model, the masculinity axis symbolizes the traditional responsibility of being the provider and ensuring external economic security. The text actually refers to this role as being the minister of foreign affairs. The intersecting femininity axis, on the other hand, represents the responsibility for raising children and managing the home, so the minister of internal affairs. The entire model pretty much hinges on these very specific defining characteristics.
Section 3. The danger of extremes.
But what actually happens when these geometric axes align just a little too perfectly? Well, the author's model maps out two specific extremes. The first is the chauvinist extreme. This happens when the masculinity axis perfectly aligns with the leading self and femininity aligns with the following self. In this specific geometry, the male gets full expression while the female is entirely suppressed. The result? The male feels frustrated by a lack of equal partnership, and the female just feels exploited. Conversely, the text outlines the feminist extreme, where femininity perfectly aligns with the leading self and masculinity is forced into the following self. According to the author's graph, this leads to the woman viewing the man with contempt, while the man becomes entirely suppressed and dependent.
The source material argues pretty strongly that both of these extremes inevitably fail. Basically, when the graph tips way too far in either direction, it creates a non-converging relationship. We're talking severe communication breakdowns, deep feelings of ingratitude on both sides, this constant nagging search for a perfect, different partner, and just a complete erosion of traditional romance. So instead of connection, these extremes just breed this hyper-individualism that leaves both people feeling completely empty.
Section 4. Finding the realistic balance.
So if both extremes fail, it begs the question, is a perfect mathematical balance actually achievable in a real marriage? Well, in geometry, the perfect balance between an x and y axis sits exactly at a 45-degree angle. Applied to Halfon's model, a 45-degree alignment between the couple would represent this theoretical state of total, absolute equality. Both partners would have an exactly equal share in personal development, career, and mutual dependency. Sounds great on paper, right?
Well, this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophy of the text. Halfon explicitly writes, "Nature contains no ideal states." He argues that striving for a perfect, 45-degree equality, sure, but it's ultimately a myth, because natural differences exist. The text asserts that artificially trying to erase these orthogonal differences, acting as if there's absolutely zero distinction between men and women, actually leads to a loss of direction and some pretty deep societal distortion.
So the crucial point here is how the author resolves this tension. He proposes a realistic compromise for harmony. In his optimal graph, the man's axis is positioned just slightly above 45 degrees, tilting toward the leading or career axis. The woman leans just slightly toward the following axis. In the context of this 1995 text, this slight tilt allows the man to focus on providing economic security, while giving the woman a slight dependency that allows her to cultivate her own personality and manage the home without having to sacrifice stability.
However, the text introduces a really critical caveat to this whole structure. While the geometric graph might make the man's leading role appear more dominant, the author insists the exact opposite is true. He argues that the male's role of providing is purely material, meaning it leaves no lasting spiritual mark on the world. The woman's role, leaning slightly toward the internal management of the family, involves raising the next generation. According to Hafen, this leaves an immeasurable, lasting spiritual impact for years to come, making her responsibility vastly more significant in the grand scheme of things.
Section 5. Fast forward to 2026. Now we reach a pretty fascinating turning point in the text, zooming way out from a single 1995 marriage to look at modern society as a whole. Let's look at the timeline to see how this builds. When Hafen looks at the world from the perspective of 2026, he notes that reality has moved much further and honestly much darker than his original geometric model ever predicted. The breakdown of this balanced coordinate system hasn't just affected individual marriages. According to him, it has literally reshaped the entire trajectory of the Western world. The updated text rapidly lists the modern threats stemming from this shift. Because people are avoiding long-term responsibilities and commitments in favor of instant gratification, he argues the family unit is under severe threat. The author points to negative birth rates in the West, which are creating these massive demographic vacuums. Furthermore, he observes a technological culture marching straight toward robotic complacency. Essentially, a society where universal income might pay people not to work at all, leading them to simply stay quiet and be endlessly entertained.
Section 6. Escaping the pawn mentality.
And this brings us to Halfon's grim conclusion. He argues that the breakdown of the relationship coordinate system ultimately leads to a breakdown in critical thought itself. The text visualizes the future of society as this highly complex chessboard. Because of the endless pursuit of comfort and a genuine fear of taking on real responsibility, the author predicts a massive gaping divide. Society will be split into just 1% of highly successful individuals, the thinkers, and a staggering 99% who are essentially passive pawns, completely paralyzed by a fear of independent thought. This leads right into Halfon's ultimate warning to future generations. To avoid becoming a passive pawn in this new societal structure, his imperative is simple but incredibly demanding. You absolutely must leave your comfort zone. He insists you must actively think, take on responsibility, and fiercely resist the complacency that modern society constantly pushes onto you. It's quite a stark transition, going from graphing a single marriage in 1995 all the way to analyzing the very survival of independent thought in 2026. This framework really forces us to look at our own lives, our relationships, and our roles in society from a completely different angle. So as we wrap up this explainer, the text leaves us with one pretty unavoidable question to ponder. When you look at the incredibly complex chessboard of modern society, which side of the board are you actually on?